You're listening to episode number 21 of the Emotional Freedom Podcast. And in today's episode, we will look at how do we learn from our failures. Stay tuned. Now, one of the things that many people are afraid of and something that they really fear, something that can actually stop them in their tracks as well as cause people not to even get started, is this fear of failure. Now, why is failure so frightening? Why is it something that many people will avoid at all cost? I think, and I speak from my own personal experience, I think it has got to do with how failure has been packaged. It has been, growing up, failure has always been frowned upon. I remember when I was still in primary school, students who fail in the test, they would be punished by the teacher. Now, in those days, teachers are allowed to take a can and then they'll start to can the students. And I remember students who fail the test, they would actually be caned by the teacher. So I think with, if you fail the test and then you receive that kind of treatment as a result of that, I think no wonder people will have a lot of fear about failure. Also, things like, for example, as we are talking, even with a group of friends, if we suddenly talk about how we have failed in our life, do you notice that sometimes our friend, they start to look at us differently? Or maybe they start to send out certain unconscious signals, maybe on their face or their expression, as well as the tone of voice. Maybe it becomes a little bit more judgmental. Now, it could be them or it could be us, because if, let's say, we felt judged, then no matter how people look at us, we would also feel like they are judging us, right? But anyway, back to this topic about failure. Now, in the Chinese, we have a saying that goes like this, 失败是成功之母, which means that, if translated into English, it means that failure is the mother of success. Now, in other words, failure is a great thing. Failure is needed. And I think in Western philosophy, it's also said that failure is one of the greatest teachers. But I think this statement, even for the Chinese version and also for the English version, I think there is something missing at the end of the line. And I think it's like this. If someone only knows how to fail, you know what? That's all they will get. They will just get failure from failure. Then when that happens, then people fail for the sake of failing. And I think that defeats the purpose. So how do we actually make full use of our experience of failure? The most important thing is to learn from it. Now, I remember back in the days, I believe it was the year 2005. Yeah, 2005. Now, I remember that year because that was the year that my son was born, and also that was the year that I did my business. You see, in 2004, my wife and I, we went over to Singapore to attend Tony Robbins' Unleash the Power Within, UPW. And what happened was, I came back, I was fully on fire, I was motivated, I walked on the fire, and I have already overcame the limitations in my head about business being very difficult, about business, high rate of failure. Basically, I think I'm cured of the fear of failure for business. And at that time, I told myself, I'm going to start to do a small business for myself, and this will be the starting of a magnificent future for my wife and I. And at that time, we have also just discovered that my wife just got pregnant, so we would be having a baby soon. So the business that I started was something that I was very passionate about, and it was teaching, and in particular, teaching English. So I started this place that is known as Great Minds Language and Training Center. Now, so I started a business, I started doing it in earnest, I looked for ways of how to minimize the cost as I'm slowly building it. But 10 months into doing that business, I began to notice that it's not growing, and I became very tired. The reason is because I'm still doing full-time job, teaching sometimes up to 40 hours a week in the private college. And at night, I would quickly rush over to my own center to start to teach a group of students. And the number of students just weren't that many. And by the end of the year, up to about October, when the school year is about to coming to a finish, I have less than 20 students. And with the low fee that I was charging, it was barely able to basically like cover costs, I think. Yeah. And within that 10 months, I decided I'm going to close it. In fact, I need to go back to working in a full-time job. And that was how I ended up working in an insurance company. But I'll leave that story for another episode. Now, and at that time, immediately I began to go back to my mind. Here I was, someone who has attended Tony's UPW, I walked on fire, but when my business didn't do well, when I failed in that business, I began to retract back into my shell, whereby I began to think about, I think this business is really going to be very difficult. So I put off that goal for quite a while, for many years in fact. In fact, it was for about 4 or 5 years until I ventured out to be a trainer and to run my own business. So what I would like to share with you about that experience of mine was that if I had just taken that experience as, you see, business is not easy, you will fail. Just like your dad failed twice and caused your family to lose everything financially. Now you are a failure too. So you know what? You should just stop thinking about being an entrepreneur, stop thinking about doing business for yourself, and just know your role. Look, know your role. Your role is just to serve faithfully in someone else's business. I'm so glad I woke up from that, because there was one part of me at one point in time where I really started to believe that. I really started to believe that failure in business ran in my blood. And that was a very depressing thought. So what did I do that was different, that caused the second time round when I started to run the business? And this time round, I call it Lighthouse Education. And what was it that caused it to become successful, but not the first time round? You see, here is the thing. How do we bounce back from failure? Right? When failure happens to us, which it will, failure will happen. There's no amount of things that you can do to prevent failure from happening. In fact, the only people who never fail are those people who never ever try anything. See, that's the best way to avoid failure, just not trying anything, yeah? So what was the difference that made the difference when it came to my second time round of running a business? And this time round was, I began to realize that to run a business successfully, it takes more than motivation. It takes more than positive thoughts. It takes more than positive affirmation. Running a successful business takes careful planning, it takes strategy, and it takes hard work. So when I launched into my own business for the second time round, I began to understand that earlier on, back in 2005, I just wasn't ready. I didn't give it much thought. I just jumped into it. I never even researched the market. I never even asked people about it. And I was like trying to do everything myself because I thought I was like Superman, because I was a really good teacher. I thought that as a good teacher, I'm going to attract lots of students. Well, wrong. Because no matter how good you are at teaching, you need to know how to market yourself. And that was something that I learned from that first failure. So if you look at from my experience, I would like to share with you that if you fail from it, then don't lose the value of that failure. Now, what I mean by that is when you encounter a failure or when you experience a failure, maximize it by learning from it. Now, how do you learn from failure? Now, the first way to learn from failure is to understand that failure occurs at two levels. Okay, and the levels are the internal and the external. Now, let's talk about both of these levels. Yeah. First, we look at the internal level. You see, internally, we are actually a body of emotion and psychology walking around. And when we fail, chances are there were things that were happening in our mind or in our psychology that led us to that failure. In my case, in my example of my first learning center, it was because I was overly optimistic, and I was so optimistic to the point that I underestimated the challenges that I would meet when I started to do my own business. And because of that, I wasn't ready. I thought that by thinking positive, by being motivated, I could take on everything. So I wasn't psychologically ready. So for the inner game, when I restarted a new business about 5 years later, what happened was This time round, I was ready for failure. In other words, when I do this business, I don't hope for it to fail, don't get me wrong, but I was totally ready to know that if it didn't do well, there is something that I can do about it. And because I was ready in the inner game, I was ready to do this business at one level. So that was the thing. So that was the failure in the inner part, in you. Now, the second level of failure that you need to learn from, identify, is the external level of the failure. Now, external level means that things that are happening outside of you. So when I look back at my own situation, the first time around I ran that business, I noticed that the external point of failure was I was trying to do everything by myself. See, I have always been someone who is really good at playing by myself. I remember when I was in Form 3, when they had this PMR in Malaysia for the very first time, we were asked to do project work. And up till then, we have never done project work, serious project work in school before. And suddenly, our grades were dependent on how good the project we did. So at first, we wanted to do it as a group. But then I begin to notice that the different people in the group, they are just not cooperating, they are not doing well. And at that time, it never occurred to me about leadership, about inspiring people, leading a team. So what I did was, I did the easiest thing that I could do, and that was do everything by myself. And I got an A for it. And I think that was probably one of the worst things that can happen to me, because that was like a reinforcement that, look, you are the best in the world, you can do everything by yourself. How wrong that is now that I think back to it. Because in this world, in the real world, not just the academic world of studying or going to school and all that, playing alone is not the way to go. Successful people, successful businesses, they are all run by teams, people. And the most precious or the most priceless skill that you can have is the ability to lead, the ability to win people's heart. And the second time around when I did business, I realized that that was my number one, my inner game that I failed. And the external game that I failed was I didn't have a team. So this time around, I found someone. And that was one of my graduates from the college. His name is Ken. And we are still in business together up to today, about 10 years already. And I looked for him because he came to me and he asked me if I would be willing to mentor him. And at that time, I was just a manager in an insurance company. I was like, what can I mentor you? But anyway, since someone wants to learn something, is a hardworking young man, all right, I just agreed to it. And then I thought to myself, can be interested to work together with me. Let's start this business together. And like a lot of people say, the rest is history, because we had a discussion and we found that our goal was quite similar, our vision was quite similar. So we teamed together and started the company. And that company, it grew into Lighthouse Education today, here in Miri, Sarawak. So that is my example of the outside failure, the external failure. You see, not all failures are from internally. Some failures are external. Some failures are internal. But the key here is to learn from this failure and to benefit from it and to maximize the value of the failure. You need to first identify, is it an internal failure or is it an external failure? And it could even be both. It could be some of both, right? All combined together. Now, the key, once you have identified the failure, is number 2, to be gentle on yourself. Now, have you ever seen parents, right, when they have babies and the babies start to learn to walk? How many of you have seen babies that they are successful at walking the very first time round? No, right? Babies, they will always fall down, they will hurt themselves, they will cry, they will hit their head, they will hit their body, but they will continue to start walking again. But let's not talk about the babies. Let's talk about the parents. How many of you have ever observed parents who are like, the moment they see their baby fall down, it's like, why are you so stupid? Why can't you walk? Why can't you stand up properly? Why must you always fall down? Stupid, wake up, walk properly. Do you see parents do that? I don't. In fact, parents will be extra gentle and they will say things like, for example, it's okay, all right? Come, walk again. Very good, Kuku. They will say things like that, right? But somehow or another, as we grow up, as we grow older, the same type of gentleness that we give to babies to encourage them to walk, we stop doing it to ourselves. And that's the point I'm getting to. And that is, when it comes to failure, if you want to learn from the failure, what is very important is you need to be gentle on yourself. And then you can begin to learn from it. So remember, we all will fail. We will all fail. Why? Because we try things. We do things. And that's a good thing. Because like I said earlier, the only way you don't have to fail is if you don't try anything. But then life would be boring. You wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want that. So if you fail, know that it is part of life. And if you have to fail, maximize the value from the failure. Don't let it go to waste. Failure is the mother of success, but only if you let yourself learn from it. So, do you experience failure right now? Well, maximize the value and learn from it. I hope you have enjoyed today's show. I'll see you tomorrow.